Hi there, welcome to our third revision video for our RMPS National 5 course. In this video we're going to be looking at the third unit, that's the problem of evil and suffering unit. And like our previous videos, I'm going to be going through that unit, looking at some of the topics, and then asking you a past paper question based on that topic. At that point you can pause the video, attempt an answer, and then restart the video and I'll give you some suggested answers that you can use to mark your work or add to your own answer. So the problem of evil and suffering really starts with a question, and that question is, how can an all-good and all-powerful God allow evil and suffering in this world, or create a world which involves evil and suffering? Okay, so in order to answer that question and look at the unit as a whole, we're going to use that image, that poster image I made for you that sums up the whole of the unit in one argument arc, kind of following that question to different responses, how different people respond to that question, that brings us back to the idea of there being a good God who's all-powerful, who may or may not be able to allow evil and suffering in the world. So, as I said, the problem of evil and suffering starts with a question. That question was first really framed by a Greek philosopher called Epicurus in 341 BC, so a long time ago. And he said this: is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is not benevolent. Is he both able and willing? Why then is there evil? So in other words, all Epicurus is saying there is God all-powerful? Then why doesn't he do something about evil? Is he really all good? Then why isn't he willing or able to do anything about evil? Well, if he's supposed to be both, then why is there evil and suffering in the world? So this is really a challenge against the classic view of a God who's good and all-powerful, a God that maybe Christians would worship, or Muslims might worship, or Jews might worship. How can that God exist when we see evil and suffering in the world? And so Epicurus' argument starts with this belief, this assumption that there is evil in the world. And of course we do see evil in all sorts of forms in the world around us. Two main forms we see evil are moral evil and natural evil. And moral evil, I guess, is anything that humankind does to cause others suffering. That might be examples, might include wars, might include injury, might include murder, or even emotional pain and relationship breakdown. Anything that humans do really to cause suffering in the world around us. Whereas natural evil is really anything in the world where suffering and evil happens without human intervention. And that could be suffering caused by natural processes such as earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes erupting, things like that. Or even just kind of viruses and things that we see, and illness we see, around us. They've always existed. Illnesses and viruses have always been part of this world. So why do they exist, and why do they cause such suffering to people? Now, in order to kind of picture this argument that a God who's all good and all powerful cannot exist if evil exists, John Mackey, an Australian philosopher, came up with this image, and it's called the inconsistent triad. And basically the inconsistent triad says that only two of these three things can be true. God is all good, God is all powerful, and evil exists. Of course, John Mackey argues that because evil exists, because we see it in the world around us, because we see tsunamis, we see people dying of hunger in the world, we see moral evil at times around us. Because we can be certain that evil exists, therefore, one of the two others isn't true. Either God is not good, and he wants evil to happen, or he's not powerful, and he allows evil to happen. So Mackey concludes that the inconsistent triad demonstrates that an all-powerful and all-good God cannot exist. And there's the conclusion there. If we were just to take that point of the argument, where Mackey brings us to with the inconsistent triad, if we were to end the argument there, our conclusion would be that the inconsistent triad clearly suggests that because evil and suffering exists in the world, either God does not exist or he cannot be omnibenevolent and omnipotent. This argument is used against the God that Christians, Muslims and Jews believe in. Now, of course, it couldn't be used against, the Greek gods, for example, many of whom were evil themselves, weren't pretending to be kind of morally perfect. But you couldn't say that those gods can't exist because Mackey's argument, the inconsistent triad, doesn't say that an evil God who's powerful can't exist. Well, an evil God who's powerful would allow evil to exist. So this argument really can only be used against the God of Christians, Jews and Muslims in particular, who all believe that God is both all good and all powerful. Mackey would say that because evil exists, an all-powerful, all-loving God does not exist. So that's the first part of the problem of evil and suffering argument arc. And so let me give you a question based on that. Here's a question for you to attempt at home. Why might suffering challenge belief in God? It's a 4-marker. So have a think about that. Have a think about the inconsistent triad. Have a think about different types of evil. And I'll give you a little moment or two. And then you can come back, if you can unpause the video and see some of the suggested answers. Okay, so why might suffering challenge belief in God? Let's have a look at some suggested answers. You can mark your own work as we go along. If someone believes in God as the creator, the designer of the universe and life, suffering may lead them to conclude that God can't exist because he wouldn't have created a world so full of pain. So this is an argument that says, well, if you really believe God created the world, then how can a loving God, how can an all-powerful God create a world with such pain, with such suffering in it? You can maybe argue that, I guess, a good God could allow a little bit of suffering, just to help us kind of, I guess, realize the privilege of life and the joy of life. So we have to suffer a little bit in order to achieve that. But when you see things in human history, like the Holocaust, you kind of wonder the level of suffering and pain that involved. How can a good God allow such suffering, such evil in the world when he created it? That might be one of your answers, and our answer could be, if someone has experienced suffering on a personal level, but felt that God has been absent, or their prayers remained unanswered, they may begin to wonder if he exists at all. So if someone really believes that God is all good and all powerful, but then they get into situations of suffering themselves and their prayers aren't answered, that may challenge their faith. God is supposed to be omniscient. That means he knows everything. Omnipotent. That means he's all powerful. And omnibenevolent. That means he's all good by definition. So that's how religious people might define God. The existence of suffering challenges these ideas of God. If God is all loving, why does he allow evil to exist? If God is all powerful, why doesn't he do anything about suffering? Because suffering exists, an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God cannot exist. So that's just really spelling out the inconsistent triad. God cannot be all loving, all powerful, and evil exists at the same time. Suffering can be seen as a necessary part of the naturalistic understanding of life and the universe. So that's just saying that actually suffering is a natural part of the universe we live in. It's just the way things are. The laws governing the evolution of the universe and life are enough to explain everything, including suffering, an inevitable consequence of natural selection. So there's no need for a supernatural explanation. So why might it challenge belief in God? Well, we can understand suffering very much from a natural perspective in the world. We can see why one animal eats another. It's because of natural selection. It's because of survival of the fittest. This is just the way our universe is. And if we can explain suffering from a natural perspective, from a scientific perspective, then really we don't need to, perhaps it doesn't need to challenge God. Perhaps God doesn't really need to be part of that explanation about suffering. So that'd be another answer you could attempt. Okay, so that's the first part of the problem of evil and suffering topic. How might someone respond to that problem? if they were a Christian believer or if they're a Muslim believer, if they believed in a God who's all good and all powerful, how would they solve this problem, particularly as it is presented in the inconsistent triad? How could a good and powerful God allow evil to exist in the world? Well, it could be, some religious people would certainly say, that God allows evil in order to give us free will. And free will is that idea that people have the freedom, we as individuals, we have autonomy to make our own choices, and we have the freedom to choose to do right or wrong in our lives. And therefore, with God giving us this choice, we are responsible for evil in the world. So a good and all-loving God might allow us free will and might allow the consequences of that because it is the best thing for us in order to actually make choices. We're not robots. We can think for ourselves. We can act for ourselves. It might be the best world that God can create, that he allows human beings free will. And this is a kind of argument developed particularly by Christian theologians, the first of which, going way back into the 2nd century, was a guy called Irenaeus, who was a Greek bishop, and he argued that God didn't actually make people perfect, but rather that he made them in a world in which they could develop, they could grow, they could learn. Particularly, they could grow in their moral understanding and action. And so Irenaeus argued that God gave us this world in which we'd have to suffer a little and learn and grow and become better people by making good choices. In order for us to genuinely develop this good morality, this good action, become kind of good, upright, moral people, we needed to suffer a little. We needed to be put in a world where we were made to make choices about our lives. And we had the opportunity to even make bad choices or make good choices. That's Irenaeus' soul-making theodicy, that our souls, our moral kind of compass, our moral kind of existence is gradually perfected through experience in life, making good choices when faced with situations of evil and suffering. However, there was another theologian, Augustine of Hippo, Christian theologian, and he argued things a little bit differently. He argued that based on the Genesis account, that is the account of God making Adam and Eve, that God made a good world without any evil in it. So God made a perfect world in the story of Genesis, of the creation of Adam and Eve. He made a perfect world, and he placed Adam and Eve, the first human beings that he made, in a garden, and the garden was called the Garden of Eden. And in that story, God gives Adam and Eve a choice. He says to them, you can eat from any fruit of any tree in the garden except from that one tree, which was called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so Adam and Eve, of course, ended up making the bad choice in the story. They were tempted by a snake, which Christians believe is a representation of the devil, to eat the fruit from the tree, saying that it would open their eyes, it would make them understand and see things the way God sees things. And so Eve ate the fruit first, and then she gave it to Adam. And then God discovered what they'd done, discovered their disobedience and their rebellion against him, discovered they'd chosen to reject what he'd asked them to do. They'd chosen to do what the devil had tempted them to do. And so God didn't destroy them, didn't kill them, but he threw them out of the garden. He banished them from the Garden of Eden. And as a result, they had to suffer outside this perfect garden where they were in a good relationship with God. Instead, they were thrown out into the world where they suffered in a world that was experiences the consequences of their disobedience, which Christians call sin. And in the Bible it says that sin and death came into the world as a result of Adam and Eve's and humanity's disobedience against God. So there's two theodicies. Now, if you want to read a little bit more about these theodicies, explanations for why a good and all-powerful God can allow evil to exist, have a look at the handout that you'll find in the Google Classroom. You can have a good read through both of those. I suggest you understand, try and really get to grips with both those theodicies. They're quite different in many ways. Look at things from a very different perspective. Get a good understanding of both of those in advance of the exam. Now the conclusion, if you're going to go along the free will argument, this is that God can allow evil and suffering in order to give us free will. If you're going to go along with the free will argument, really the conclusion is, well, this is really from a Christian perspective primarily, but the conclusion would be something like this. An all-powerful, all-good God might have a good reason to allow suffering. Giving human beings free will to make moral choices could be considered such a good reason. Christians believe that God allows humanity to experience the consequences of evil actions. So Adam and Eve were thrown out of the garden. They experienced the consequences of those actions. But God also offers people a way to be forgiven by sending Jesus, who Christians believe is the Son of God, to die on the cross and take the punishment for the evil that humanity has committed. Now, Christians believe that the cross, the fact that God sends Jesus to die on the cross, shows, for them it's ultimately the answer to the problem of evil and suffering, because it shows that God is both good, because he loves us enough to die for us, and that he's also powerful, because he responds to evil with justice. That Jesus dies, he suffers for the evil that humanity has committed, and instead humanity is offered forgiveness from God. So the conclusion would be, if you were to conclude in one sentence, it would be that evil and suffering does not mean that a perfectly good and all-powerful God does not exist. And that Christians and other religious groups would say that God can allow evil and suffering in the world because he's got a bigger plan. Maybe we don't see all of it, but we certainly see some of it. And for Christians, part of that plan is demonstrated in Jesus' death on the cross, and that God has a purpose for allowing evil and suffering, but he wants to bring it to an end to forgive people. So there's that second part of the argument, the free will response to evil and suffering. How about pausing the video now and having a go at this next question? Choose a religious viewpoint you've studied. How does it explain the existence of suffering? You can imagine that's a 4 marker, okay? So a religious viewpoint, I'd suggest Christianity. How does it explain the existence of suffering? Okay, so let's have a look at a suggested answer for that question. Here's one. The Christian story of creation says that God created Adam and Eve and gave them a choice to obey him. Augustine of Hippo argued that they chose to disobey God and allowed them to experience suffering as a consequence. That's obviously Augustine's theodicy. Christians believe that God is loving, but allows his children to suffer the consequences of their disobedience. That shows that he's also fair and just. So Christians argue that because God didn't destroy us all, didn't destroy Adam and Eve, he's loving, but he's also fair, he's also just, there's also a consequence for disobedience. So there's one suggested answer. Let's look at another. Christianity teaches that all people have free will and suffering is a result of bad moral choices. Natural evil is also the result of man's rebellion against God. So again, Christianity, like many world religions, would say that we as human beings have free will, and therefore any evil that we commit is our responsibility. It's not God's responsibility. He's not responsible. Rather, because we have free will, because we have the right ability to choose right and wrong, we are responsible. But also, Christians would argue that natural evil in the world around us, earthquakes, tsunamis, that these are all actually also part of or consequence of our rebellion against God, that he has allowed the natural world to experience the consequences of disobedience also, the world we live in. So all of that, both our moral evil and the natural evil in the world, are the results of our rebellion against God, according to Christianity. Some people believe that God sends suffering and evil as a punishment for sin, and some say God sends it to test or strengthen their faith. So some religious people would argue that suffering is a punishment for mankind's evil in the world. They would see that as God kind of laying out his punishment for the wrong things people do. Irenaeus argued that God did not create humans perfect, but with the potential to become perfect by developing good moral actions. in order to genuinely exercise free will for the purposes of human development, we need to live in a world where pain and suffering are real. And we've explained that. That's part of Irenaeus' theodicy. Christianity teaches that God is omniscient, which means nothing happens that God is not aware of. Omniscient means all-knowing. Suffering must therefore be part of his greater plan, which is beyond the ability of humans to know. So this answer is recognizing that we have a limited understanding of the world we live in. We only see a little part of it. God, however, he knows everything. He sees everything. Therefore, he maybe has a greater plan than we are aware of. And part of that plan involves suffering and evil. It might be a mystery to us, but he knows it fully. Some Christians say that God doesn't want suffering, but permits it as the price of free will. So, yes, some Christians would say that God doesn't want suffering in the world. He didn't create it. But, and you can go back to the Adam and Eve story, he allows it in order for us to have choice in our life, to choose right and wrong. And he allows that for us. Christianity teaches that God sent Jesus, his son, into the world, and Jesus was sent to take the punishment for mankind's disobedience by dying on the cross, so that God could offer people forgiveness for moral evil. Christianity teaches that God suffers with mankind, showing that he is a God of love, and he does something about evil, showing that he is all-powerful. So the story of Jesus is really Christians' answer to the problem of evil and suffering, that God demonstrates his love for us, and he demonstrates his power and his justice in dealing with the evil and suffering in the world. So that's the first response to the problem of evil and suffering would be the free will argument, concluding that evil and suffering does not mean that a perfectly good and all-powerful God does not exist. That God could have a reason for allowing evil and suffering in the world. The next part of the argument, or the next response to that, someone could respond to free will with a determinism argument. And the argument of determinism really questions, are we free? Can we really make choices in the world that we live? Are things not determined for us? For example, our kind of situation in life. We don't choose where we're born or when we're born. We're born into a particular time in human history, and we're born into a particular place, a particular country. And that all influences our lives and really changes a lot of the choices we can make. So determinism argues that all behaviour, everything we do, everything we say, every choice we make has a cause, a chain of events that have influenced our choices. And that free will, this idea we're free to choose whatever we like, well, that's an illusion. We do not have a choice and are therefore not responsible for moral evil. If we don't have any real choice, if things are all determined for us, how can you blame anyone who doesn't have a choice, who does something wrong? They're not the ones to blame. Determinism would say that free will is not the case. We don't have that choice, and that our actions are actually determined. Now, determinism talks about influences that are on our lives that effectively lead us to do and act and behave and be the way that we are. Two of these main influences might be, one, for example, genetics. Our DNA influences everything about us, from the colour of our hair to the chemical and physical structure of our brains. So DNA changes everything about us. It also could have an influence on our moral choices in different ways. Why do certain people who are born, why do they present more aggressive tendencies, perhaps, within certain cultures or certain groups of people? It could be argued that in some way their biology affects some of their actions. Another influence on people's lives would be their experiences. Past experiences shape someone's personality and their morality. Statistical data demonstrates that those who have suffered abuse at a young age are more likely to become abusers. How much can we be held accountable for our own actions if we've had negative experiences in the past? So some people might argue that our experiences, the things we've experienced in the past, good and bad, influence us and influence our choices. If we'd never had those experiences, if we'd had better experiences, would we end up making better choices? If we have worse experiences, would we end up making worse choices and bad moral choices in our lives? So these two things can influence the way we live, can determine perhaps some parts of our lives and what happens in our lives. And this leads to two types of determinism, two ways of explaining how maybe our lives have been determined. The first is causal determinism. Causal determinism argues that moral choices, like the natural world, follow the physical laws of cause and effect. Now, cause and effect is that for everything that happens, there's a reason that it happened. Something followed. Okay, now a simple illustration of that would be dominoes. Okay, when you see one domino fall over, well, the reason it's fallen over is because another domino fell and knocked over. And the reason for that one is another domino fell and knocked over. And that goes all the way back to probably someone pushing over that first domino. So that cause and that effect that you see working out in dominoes falling over. Now, in the natural world, there's all sorts of causes and effects that we see. For example, there's always a reason, there's always a cause for a volcano erupting. And that might be the movement and shifting of plates, the movement of plates. It might be the kind of the thermodynamic underworkings of the earth. Okay, there's a reason why volcanoes erupt. Something that's led up to that, a process that's led up to that eruption. And it's the same, some people would argue the same with our moral choices. Okay, that actually the choices we make in life are all being influenced by something before that. And that our moral choices are just like that domino effect. Something always leads up to the choices we make. And so if actually our moral choices have that kind of, if there's actually influences on the choices we make like that, then were we ever going to make another choice? Or was our choices, our good and bad choices, always determined by the things that preceded them? And again, that question is, do we really have free will if all our choices are determined? So that's one way of looking at determinism, causal determinism. Another would be theological determinism. And that says that if God knows everything from the beginning of time, theological determinism starts with the idea that, okay, but let's say God does exist. And if he knows everything, and this God who exists knows everything from the very beginning of time to the very end, then, well, he knows what we're going to do before we do it. Okay, he knows everything about us. In fact, that makes you ask the question, did he predestine? Has he already decided what our lives are going to be like when he created us? Does he know what our actions, what our experiences are going to be? And therefore, if God knows it all, and if he created it with the knowledge that everything was going to happen the way it is, and we were going to make the choices we were going to make, therefore, isn't God responsible? Isn't that kind of God responsible for moral evil and not humanity? If God knew, for example, again, the Holocaust was going to happen and humans were going to do it when he created the world, can he have just tweaked his creation a little bit to make sure that the Holocaust didn't happen, or intervened to stop it in some way? So if he's determined it all, if this God has a plan for our whole lives and has determined it from beginning to end, how can we really be called responsible? And how can we even have anything like free will if he knows and he's planned it all out already? Now, the conclusion of the determinism argument is that because our evil moral actions are determined, because we do evil moral actions, because they've all been determined for us, and all-powerful, all God cannot exist. If we don't really have free will, if all our actions are determined, then how can God exist? How can he have created us to do evil when he knew it from the very beginning? So our determinism demonstrates that a good and all-powerful God cannot exist. Let's have a go at a past paper question now. So pause the video and have a look at this one. How might a non-religious person explain evil? And you can imagine it's a 6-marker. Have a go at getting 6 marks, thinking through how a non-religious person might explain it. You might think about that determinism argument, particularly causal determinism. Have a think about the influences that involves on someone's lives. So if you pause the video just now, have a go at that question, and then I'll give you some suggested answers. Okay, so let's look at some suggested answers for that question. Evil does not exist as a force. It's just a label we use as an explanation for bad things. That could get you 1 mark. Evil is a superstitious belief that has been promoted by religions for their own purposes. Okay, that could give you another mark. So I guess religions, certainly religious people, would see evil almost as a force. They would see it personified in the devil, that evil is this kind of force against God, and the devil is an example of that. And the devil tempts people, and people do bad things and cause suffering as a result. So a non-religious person, in opposite to that, would say that evil isn't a force. There's no devil, there's nothing like that. It's just a label. It's just something we use to explain bad things in the natural world we see. And they would also say that evil is a superstitious belief that perhaps religions use for their own purposes. Here's another explanation. From a non-religious perspective, evil has no explanation. It's just part of life. The Big Bang set off a chain of determined events that produced a universe in which evil and suffering are experienced due to natural events such as volcanoes or earthquakes, or moral evil acted out by humans such as the Holocaust. So for a non-religious person, evil and the world is just the way it is, really, and that the natural chain of events in the world produces a universe that we see, and the kind of events, both natural and in human history, that we see. God is not involved in that. The evil actions of some people are due to the influences of genetics and experience. All our actions are to some degree influenced by our genetics. Some people are more likely to be aggressive or selfish, depending on their genes. That could get you 1 mark. People can also be influenced by their experiences. For example, if someone has experienced aggressive behaviour in childhood, they're more likely to be aggressive towards others. That could get you 1 mark. Humanists, it's one of the non-religious groups we looked at, do not believe that God exists, but believe that people have the capacity to do good or evil. As rational beings, we can think for ourselves and make good moral choices, or we can cause suffering to others, to ourselves or others. So humanists believe that we are able to decide ourselves, that we don't need God to decide or make or define what good and evil is, but rather we can think for ourselves, we can make good moral choices for ourselves and help or cause suffering to others in the world around us. Okay, so we've been through the whole argument arc there. We've seen how the question of the problem of evil and suffering leads to this inconsistent triad that can be responded to by free will. It can be one of the responses people how to explain why God might allow evil, which in turn can be responded to by determinism that says, well, we don't really have free will, and therefore if we don't have free will, again, how can a good God allow suffering and evil in the world? Which brings us back to the inconsistent triad and the problem of evil and suffering. So with all that knowledge, again, you can go and look at your own poster image, or you can check out the image of the poster in the Google Classroom. Have a go answering this question altogether. An 8 marker. Suffering and evil means you can't believe in a good God. Do you agree? And give reasons for your answer. Okay, so this is an agree-disagree question. It's 8 marks. You can give reasons why you might agree with the statement that suffering and evil means you can't believe in a good God. You can give reasons why you disagree with the statement that suffering and evil means you can't believe in a good God. And then come to some kind of your own conclusion. So make it clear to the marker how evaluating the points in agreement, the points in disagreement, weigh them up and say in the end what your own opinion is. What do you think? Does suffering and evil mean that you cannot believe in a good God? So have a go at that question, pause the video, and then I'll suggest some answers. Okay, so here are some suggested answers for that 8 marker. So there's a few points in the agree column and a few in the disagree column. Here's one for agree. A good God can't exist because he does nothing to stop evil and suffering, even though it would be within his power to do so. That would give you 1 mark. The fact that God does nothing suggests he doesn't want to do anything, and this challenges the idea that God is omnibenevolent. So if God does nothing, maybe he doesn't want to do anything about it, about evil and suffering, how can he then be a good God? How can you call him a good God, a God who doesn't want to do anything about evil and suffering in the world? Belief in a just God makes no sense because life isn't fair. Evil people often flourish while good people suffer. The idea that God uses evil and suffering to punish people who do things wrong, who make bad moral choices, well, that can't be right, because we see in the world large numbers of people who've done nothing wrong suffer horrendous things. So how can God be just? How can it be a just God who allows evil and suffering? The natural world is so full of suffering, such as cats playing with mice, or any other animal killing any other animal, or wasps laying their eggs in caterpillars. This challenges faith, because even if the world was created by God, the cruelty in nature suggests a cruel designer. So when we look at the natural world and we see such cruelty, such suffering, we kind of wonder what kind of designer made this world? And that answer would suggest it was a cruel designer, someone who made a God that made the world to experience suffering in a cruel way. Therefore, how can there be a good God? There may be a purpose. So we're looking at disagree column now. Disagreeing with suffering and evil means you can't believe in a good God. There may be a purpose behind their suffering. Many people who've experienced suffering describe a special feeling of love and closeness to God through their suffering. So we might not know the reason for suffering, but certainly religious people express that when they go through times of suffering, they experience closeness to God. They experience closeness through times of suffering. Maybe answers to their prayers, maybe just a sense that He is near them in their pain. For Christians, God entered fully into the human experience of suffering in the form of Jesus, and this was to ultimately defeat evil and suffering and to give hope of a future where there would be no pain. So for Christians, God allows evil and suffering, and we can see that He is a good God, particularly because of sending Jesus, His Son, to die on the cross because He loves us, to offer us forgiveness. So again, we don't know the full answer to evil and suffering, but we can see that God is a good God, even although there's evil and suffering in the world. A good God would have to give His creations free will in order for their lives and their worship to be meaningful. Suffering is a consequence of the misuse of this free will. And finally, in a world without the potential for suffering, we couldn't exist. So it's just questioning the reality of our world. Actually, for our world to exist at all, there needs to be good and bad. There needs to be evil and suffering and joy. We wouldn't even understand what happiness and peace was like if we'd never experienced sadness, pain, and suffering in our lives. Okay, so I think that's all the questions. So I hope this video has helped you just go through that unit, think through some of those topics within the unit. There are other revision materials and our lesson materials you can go back and look at through the Google Classroom. But if you feel ready, and if you've attempted all of that, I'm sure you are ready for the exam coming up on the 16th. You will do great. If you've studied and worked hard, I'm sure you will achieve a good grade. Go in with confidence, just relax, and make the most of that time you have in the exam hall to write out your answers clearly and use all the knowledge that you've learned. So good luck. I'll be thinking of you. I look forward to see you after the exam on the 16th.